They say death is final, that once the heart stops, the suffering ends. But what if, in the very moment a man is laid on the gurney, his own heart fights back? Not metaphorically, but literally. Wires pulsing, metal embedded deep within his chest, designed to shock life back into him, even as the state prepares to end it. That's the fate awaiting Byron Lewis Black, a man nearly 70 years old, frail, diagnosed with dementia, a heart patient with a defibrillator in his chest, one that might send electric shocks while lethal drugs pump through his veins. In Tennessee, that's not science fiction. That's an actual plan. But this isn't a tale about a malfunctioning machine. It's about a broken man, a shattered family, a decades-long legal war that questioned everything, from mental competence to the ethics of modern execution. And it all began on a quiet morning in March 1988, when 3 lives were stolen in a single, brutal moment. A mother, her 2 daughters, gone. On today's episode on True Crime Briefing, we step into that darkness. We revisit the blood-stained living room, the autopsy tables, the courtroom floors. We listen to psychiatrists, to grieving families, to judges balancing justice and mercy. Because when the state prepares to end a life, the questions don't stop at, what did he do? We must also ask, what does it mean to kill a man who may already be gone in mind and memory? This is not just another execution story. This is Byron Black. Byron Lewis Black was born in 1954, a quiet boy in rural Tennessee. No headlines, no flashing lights, just a childhood marked by isolation, academic struggles, and whispers from teachers who suspected something wasn't quite right. From a young age, Byron didn't seem to process the world the way others did. He struggled to read. His attention wandered. And when emotions ran high, he didn't have the words to keep up. Doctors would later estimate his IQ was consistently below 70, placing him in the range of intellectual disability. But in those days, kids like Byron were simply called slow, or worse. As he grew older, things didn't get easier. School ended early, jobs came and went, relationships were unstable. But one thing remained constant. He felt like he didn't belong. By the time he reached his 30s, Byron was living a marginal life. Poor, emotionally erratic, and heavily medicated for symptoms that would later be diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenia. He met Angela Clay in the mid-1980s. She was bright, independent, and a single mother of 2 beautiful daughters, LaToya, 9 years old, and Lakeisha, just 6. For a brief time, it seemed like they found a fragile peace together. They shared an apartment in East Nashville. He helped raise the girls. She believed, perhaps naively, that Byron just needed stability and love. But beneath the surface, the cracks were widening. Byron became possessive, then violent. He accused Angela of cheating. He resented the time she spent with her daughters. His medication wasn't enough to quell the demons in his mind. And the more paranoid he became, the closer he drifted to something irreversible. By early 1988, friends noticed Angela pulling away. She wanted out, but she didn't know how to leave safely. And then, she ran out of time. Angela Clay was the kind of mother who never stopped working for her daughters. She had dreams of opening her own salon someday. She was enrolled in a beautician program, often studying late into the night. Friends remember her as joyful, determined, and fiercely protective of her girls. LaToya was in 4th grade, bright-eyed, always asking questions, obsessed with drawing and dancing. She loved her baby sister and often helped Angela with chores when Byron wasn't around. Lakeisha, the youngest, had just started school. Shy, with a soft voice, and a tendency to hide behind her mom's leg when strangers visited. The three of them were inseparable. They lived in a modest duplex on Ewing Drive in Nashville, a small place with hand-me-down furniture, stacks of school books, and family photos taped to the fridge. But those walls bore witness to more than just bedtime stories and school lunches. They echoed with the sound of arguments, of slammed doors, of Byron's rising temper. Angela tried to shield the girls. She tried to end things with him. But Byron's paranoia only grew. He accused her of seeing other men. He feared she'd take the children and disappear. And he began threatening not just her, but the girls too. She told friends she was scared, but no one expected what would happen next. It was March 28, 1988. Angela hadn't shown up for class. Her instructor, concerned, tried calling. No answer. By late afternoon, her mother asked a neighbor to check on the apartment. What they found inside was a nightmare. Angela's body was discovered on the living room floor. Shot once in the head. In the bedroom, lying side by side, were LaToya and Lakeisha. Both had been shot execution style while they slept. No struggle, no time to scream, just silence. Frozen innocence. Police quickly determined there were no signs of forced entry, no valuables stolen, no evidence of an outside intruder. Attention turned immediately to Byron Black, Angela's live-in boyfriend, who was nowhere to be found. Within hours, he was located at a nearby motel, disoriented, bloodstains on his shirt. The murder weapon, a .22 caliber pistol, was later traced back to him. In the interrogation room, Byron gave confusing, rambling answers. He mentioned voices. He talked about betrayal. He seemed detached from the reality of what he'd done. But the facts were undeniable. He had murdered Angela, then turned the gun on her sleeping daughters. The community was horrified. Nashville had seen murders before, but this was something else. A whole family. Erased. The DA vowed to seek the death penalty, and the trial began. The trial of Byron Lewis Black began in early 1989 in Davidson County Criminal Court. And from the outset, there was no question of who had done it. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution didn't need a twist or a confession. They had the gun. They had the motive. They had the man. But what they needed to prove was that Byron Black deserved to die for it. The prosecutor painted a chilling portrait, a controlling boyfriend, consumed by jealousy, who executed a mother and her 2 children simply because he couldn't control them. He described it as a calculated extermination, not a sudden act of rage, but cold, premeditated murder. He emphasized how Byron shot Angela in the head, then turned the weapon on the girls as they slept, without mercy. Photos of the crime scene were shown in court. Angela's body, sprawled on the living room carpet. The girls in their beds, still tucked under their blankets. Members of the jury wept. One had to be excused. But the defense took a different route. They didn't deny that Byron pulled the trigger. Instead, they argued that his mind was broken. so deeply fractured by schizophrenia and intellectual disability that he didn't fully understand his actions. Expert witnesses testified that he had long-standing mental illness, that he heard voices, that his IQ had tested consistently in the 60s. The defense team pleaded for compassion, not because he was innocent, but because he was too impaired to be fully responsible. But the jury was unmoved. After 2 weeks of harrowing testimony, they deliberated for only a few hours. The verdict: guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. And when it came time for sentencing, they chose death. The courtroom was silent when the sentence was read. Angela's mother sobbed quietly in the front row. One juror stared at the floor. Byron, pale and expressionless, simply lowered his head. At Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, where Tennessee houses its death row inmates, Byron Black became inmate. He was 35 years old. And, if the law held firm, he would one day be put to death by the state of Tennessee. But that day wouldn't come for a very long time. Death sentences in America often don't lead quickly to the death chamber. In Byron Black's case, they led to decades of legal warfare. His attorneys filed appeal after appeal on grounds that would haunt the case for more than 30 years. Most centered around one simple argument: that Byron Black should never have been sentenced to death in the first place, because his mental and intellectual disabilities made such a punishment unconstitutional. The U.S. Supreme Court had ruled in Atkins v. Virginia, 2002, that executing the intellectually disabled violated the Eighth Amendment ban on cruel and unusual punishment. But proving intellectual disability in court wasn't simple, especially for someone like Byron, whose diagnosis was muddied by a long, complicated history of trauma, institutionalization, and inconsistent mental health records. In 2004, he filed a petition in Tennessee court seeking relief under Atkins, but the court ruled against him, saying the evidence was insufficient at the time. Years passed. Meanwhile, Byron's physical health declined. He suffered multiple strokes. He developed congestive heart failure, severe kidney disease, and was diagnosed with early-stage dementia. At times, he couldn't recall the names of his attorneys. He mumbled about angels and demons during psychiatric evaluations. One doctor described him as barely tethered to reality. Then, in 2021, Tennessee passed a new law allowing death row inmates with intellectual disability to bring renewed claims, even if they'd lost earlier ones. Byron's lawyers moved quickly. They filed under the new law, pointing to years of state and independent evaluations that showed he met every standard of intellectual disability: sub-average IQ, impaired functioning, and early onset. The state did not contest the diagnosis. Even their own expert admitted it was true. Byron Black was intellectually disabled, but the courts denied his request anyway, arguing that his earlier 2004 petition barred him from seeking relief under the new rules. In essence, the court acknowledged that he was disabled, but said the law didn't allow for a new review because of procedural default. Legal scholars were stunned. One Vanderbilt professor called the ruling an ethical disaster. Another said Tennessee was effectively admitting it's about to execute someone who legally shouldn't be eligible for death. But the ruling stood, and the countdown to execution resumed. Then came the hard issue. In 2024, doctors at a Tennessee hospital implanted a cardiac defibrillator into Byron Black's chest, a device meant to jolt his heart back into rhythm if it failed. A safeguard, a life-saving tool. But in the context of a lethal injection, it became a chilling complication. Byron's legal team argued that the device could interfere with his death. As pentobarbital shuts down the nervous system, the defibrillator might detect his heart stopping and try to restart it, repeatedly shocking his body as the drugs paralyze and suffocate him. Experts warned this could result in an agonizing, drawn-out death. One doctor described it as being tortured on the gurney. They requested the device be deactivated right before the execution. On July 18, 2025, a Davidson County judge agreed, ordering that the defibrillator be turned off just before the lethal injection. The ruling emphasized that this posed no meaningful burden to the state, and failing to do so would risk violating Black's constitutional rights. But the Tennessee Supreme Court intervened. On July 31st, it overturned the lower court's decision, stating that ordering the deactivation effectively acted as a stay of execution, something only higher courts had authority to grant. In other words, they weren't saying Black was wrong. They were saying the judge didn't have the power to make that call. The ruling left one chilling possibility: that Byron Black would be strapped to the gurney, with a machine in his chest designed to keep him alive, at the very moment the state tries to kill him. His attorneys have now filed an emergency motion with the U.S. Supreme Court. But as of today, less than 24 hours before the scheduled execution, no stay has been granted. As the sun sets over Nashville on August 5th, 2025, a man will be led into a sterile, windowless room. He will lie down on a padded gurney, his limbs fastened with thick leather straps. A curtain will rise. Witnesses, some reporters, some victims' relatives, maybe even a chaplain, will sit silently behind glass. The state of Tennessee will attempt to end the life of Byron Lewis Black. But if the courts remain silent, if no intervention comes, then what dies on that gurney may not be a man as much as a body whose mind may already be gone. A body wired to resist death, even as death arrives. A body carrying the weight of 3 innocent lives lost in a moment of rage and mental collapse. Angela, Latoya, and Lakeisha, names that should never fade. And yet, this execution isn't just about what happened in 1988. It's about what we've chosen to do in 2025. It's about whether we, as a society, can look into the face of mental illness and intellectual disability and still proceed with a punishment designed for the most culpable. It's about whether mercy should ever reach into the cell of a broken man, and whether vengeance, decades later, is truly justice or simply ritual. Because when the state flips the switch, it doesn't just end a life. It writes a final sentence, a sentence that will forever define how we treat the damaged, the damned, and the ones who no longer recognize their own names. Byron Black may never speak again. We've told his story. The story of a man who destroyed a family, and of a system that spent nearly 4 decades deciding what to do with him. On the morning of August 5th, 2025, Byron Lewis Black was served his last meal. A simple request: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, and sweet tea. He ate quietly in his cell at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. His final hours were spent alone, though earlier that week he was visited by his spiritual advisor. Byron Lewis Black lay on the gurney at Riverbend Prison. At 10:43 a.m., the lethal injection began. Dozens watched in silence. His chest was restrained. He looked around the room, raising and lowering his head. Witnesses described heavy breathing and lips quivering. Then he said, "It's hurting so bad." His spiritual advisor knelt beside him, responding gently, "I'm so sorry," singing softly and touching his face as his strength faded. Black, 69 years old, had suffered from dementia, kidney failure, heart disease, and an implanted defibrillator that remained active during the execution, which the state refused to deactivate after several motions to do so. He made no final statement. When asked, he replied, "No, sir." He left behind no words for the world. As the drugs took full effect, the room fell silent. At 10:43 a.m., Byron Black was pronounced dead. This has been True Crime Briefing. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, behind every headline is a human life.